Okay,
Great.
so let's get started. I'm Donna Vitale. I am your host for today. I'm from the Rogers Park Westridge Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to episode 2 of the 2020 Historic House Walk. We're going virtual this year, but we're thrilled that we're able to offer this version of what has become a 34-year neighborhood tradition. So we're very happy to have you all. I'm on the board of the Historical Society, and on behalf of the whole board, I want to thank people for the amazing loyalty and support that they have been showing for this whole entire year. We've had a lot of kind of a steady stream of new members coming in, and people are renewing their memberships. The few events we've been able to have had good participation. We're getting steady traffic to our website and our Facebook page and our Twitter feed, and it's inspiring, and it helps us want to coming up with even more and better programs and activities in the months ahead. So thank you all. As many of you know, the annual house tour is one of the events that helps fund all of our other activities. So if you are able to support us in any way that works for you, please do. You can donate, you can become a member, you can renew your membership, buy our books, or even ask for a property history quest report on your own home, which is for a fee, the way our house tour hosts have already been doing. We've had some incredible response to that service, and we're really happy about it. There will be links to all those things in our chat, or you can go to our website anytime and see what's coming up on the calendar, check out our other resources, and do any of those support activities. Before we get started, I want to introduce some of the volunteers who make all of this work possible. First, I think we have at least 2 members of our Property History Quest research team with us today, Barb Weaver and Laurel Clayson. They and other team members are the ones who do all the research that turns up the stories on the houses on our tour, and without them we couldn't do it. And you're going to see some of the work that came out of their activity today and in the subsequent weeks. Someone else I want to introduce is Erin McNeil, who's our events coordinator, who's handling all the Zoom details for the day. So Erin, unmute yourself and say hello and tell them whatever you want to tell them at this point.
Hi, everybody. I'm here under the Rogers Park Westridge Historical Society's account. If you have any sort of questions throughout or any sort of technical difficulties, feel free to message the Rogers Park Westridge Historical Society account, and I can help you out with that. So enjoy today's presentation, and I look forward to meeting you all in person as soon as we can.
Thank you. Another person who's been working on this to make this particular event happen is the other member of our tour team, Sarah Fiola, who just became a volunteer as the shutdown was starting, and she got plunged into this whole project feet first. Sarah's been coordinating with our homeowner hosts, and as part of that, she's even stepped up and learned how to make and edit videos. You'll be seeing some of her work today as we take our video tour. So Sarah, say hello and tell them your part.
Hi, everybody, welcome. Yeah, that's true. I'm pretty new. I'm gonna be handling the questions for the presentation today. And the way that's gonna work is Donna's she's gonna talk about the presentation. And if you have a question, go ahead and enter it in the chat. I'm going to call all the questions and ask her after the presentation is over. So I'll be keeping track of that.
Okay, lastly, I want to acknowledge our homeowner host for today, Julian DaCosta Faro. I haven't seen him on, but I hope you're here, Julian. If you're not, we'll meet him later in the video tour. without the support of the people who are actually giving us the tours today and for the next 4 weeks, we couldn't be doing this. So we're really appreciative of their participation, really above all. So that being said, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen again. I hope I do this right. Hold on a minute. Where is it? Here. Share and start the slideshow. Okay, so to get us oriented, I wanted to look at some maps first. This map is from 1862. It's actually all of Rogers Park. This is Howard Street on the north. Actually, I think this is Howard Street on the north. Devon is down here. The western edge is western, and then the lake over here. It's a pretty big territory. In 1862, this map was designed to show who owned plots of land in Cook County. And if you count all these plots, there's only about 25 different owners in Rogers Park at that time. That's because there was not much in Rogers Park at that time. It was mostly farms and empty land, and much of it was held for later development after the Civil War. There's familiar names on this list. You see P. Rogers, that's Philip Rogers, who is the namesake of Rogers Park. There's the Marshalls, the Murphys, the Fortmans. These are all names that are quite familiar to the history of the neighborhood. And many of you have probably heard those names over the years for one reason or another. One that is not familiar, wasn't familiar to me, I'd never heard of him before, was H. Seymour. He's the owner of this strip of property, which is much bigger than it looks. This is Pratt to Devon at the bottom here. This is about Glenwood, and this is, I believe, Ashland. So this is a major multi-block area of the city, and it all was owned by this man named Henry H. Seymour. We'll get to him in a minute, but this is the land where our house is that we're going to be visiting today, right about smack dab in the middle of it. And just to show you more, let's take a look at what happened to the land over the years. This is 1905. And in 1905, this is our block on the 6600 block of Newgard Avenue. We're not going to tell you the exact address just to protect the privacy of our homeowner, but it was right here. The fact that this part of the map is beige and not one of these lovely pastel colors tells us that this area had no development in it at the time. The colored areas are references to bigger maps that when they're blown up, they show individual structures that were put on the map so that fire insurance companies could decide if they wanted to insure them or not. And there's lots of these maps around that tell us when things were built and what they were built of and that kind of stuff. But the fact that this part is empty tells us there's absolutely nothing that was built there, and no maps of those areas were available. Just for orientation, you see the streets were laid out. Newgard was spelled with a T on this map. That was a version of the way it was spelled, but now it's called Newgard with a D. Southport is now called Glenwood Avenue, and Hayes is now called Arthur. And so at the corner of Glenwood and Hayes, for those of you who know the Glenwood and Arthur, those of you who know the neighborhood, this would be where St. Ignatius Church is today. In 1905, it wasn't there. Not much was there. In a few years after that, everything was built up. This area started getting developed at about this time when Loyola University moved its campus to where it is today. So this was 1905. Today, of course, it's just one thing after another, all houses, two flats. larger apartment buildings. This is the block of Newgard that we're talking about, the 6600 block, and this is our home. And as I said, we're not going to tell you the address, but you could figure it out if you just go take a walk, I suppose. So what was the story of this land, and why did it stay empty from 1862 to 1905, and then what happened to it afterwards, and who lived in the house? That's all the stuff we're going to be talking about today. Let's go back to H. Seymour. As I said, that was a name I had never heard of and wondered who it was. So we started doing research, and we found there were actually two H. Seymours. The first one was Henry Seymour. He was born in 1780 in Connecticut. He was the third or fourth generation of an old colonial family, and his relatives all fought in the American Revolution, and he was born right after the end of the Revolution. As a young man, Henry did what a lot of people in the original 13 states did, which was go west and settle the frontier, which in those days was upstate New York. And he ended up in Utica, New York, where he became quite prominent in the area. He served as the mayor of Utica. He was in politics. He was in the New York State Legislature, and he was on the commission that oversaw the construction of the Erie Canal in the 1820s. Erie Canal, of course, was extremely important to the history of our area because it was the first thing that made a route through water from the East Coast, from New York City up the Hudson River, through the Erie Canal, over to the Great Lakes. And then once you're in the Great Lakes, you could go down Lake Erie, get to rivers in Ohio. You could go across Michigan and get to Chicago. From Chicago, you could go down rivers and get to the Mississippi and pretty much get anywhere in the West from there. So possibly as a result of his work on the Erie Canal, Henry was pretty tuned into the business opportunities in the Northwest Territory, which is what we were called then. So he engaged a man who also was from Utica, but had moved out to the West in the 1830s, just as Chicago was being settled, 1833, called Jeremiah Price. And the agreement with Jeremiah Price was that he would travel around these new territories and buy up land that would be good investments for Henry. And he had criteria that said he'd buy near places that would become town settlements and whatever. So Chicago was established in 1833. You can imagine Chicago was one area where Jeremiah Price spent a lot of time buying up land for Henry. One of the properties he bought was the plot of land that we're actually talking about today. This is an original land patent. It was granted to Henry Seymour of Oneida County, New York, and his heirs, which become important because this is dated 1839. Just as a side note, it actually is signed in the name of President Martin Van Buren, who had been a New York politician and an ally of Henry's earlier, but by now he was president. 1839 is important because Henry actually died in 1837. So he never really owned this land. His estate owned this land. And that fact was one of the things that kept it empty for so long because it got embroiled in a dispute over settlement of the estate and of the partnership over the years. So again, our question, who was H. Seymour? There was another H. Seymour, and that was one of the heirs to the estate, Horatio Seymour, was Henry's oldest son. He followed his father into politics and actually became governor of New York twice. He was elected once, then defeated, then he ran again later and was elected again, all during the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. He was very politically active. That, of course, was the time when the big controversy in the United States was over slavery. You had disputes between the North and the South, but you also had disputes in the North between the people who wanted to preserve the Union and were willing to compromise on the issue of slavery in order to do that, and the abolitionists who wanted to get rid of slavery and were not willing to make compromises. In that controversy, Horatio was one of the compromiser types. He supported Stephen Douglas in the election of 1860, and then Douglas was, of course, defeated by Abraham Lincoln. That caused the big start of the whole Civil War. During the Civil War, he was supportive of the Union. He didn't sympathize with the South or anything, but he continued to be critical of Lincoln and maintained his criticism and his desire to reach some kind of agreement, such that he was named as the presidential candidate in 1868 to run against Ulysses S. Grant. And the fact that we probably all know who Ulysses S. Grant was and never heard of Horatio Seymour until today tells you who won that election. All of this was going on while this land dispute was going on over this property and all the other property that Jeremiah Price had bought for Henry Seymour. It went on all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the dispute was actually settled in the Supreme Court in 1868, just as Horatio was running for president. It was not settled in his favor. The decision was that the land had to be shared with the heirs of Jeremiah Price, who had also died by this time. And so in 1869, there was a great land sale, an auction that was offering 2,000 acres of land, the estates of Henry Seymour and Jeremiah Price, in the city of Chicago, Cook and Will County, town of Joliet, DuPage and Grundy County. So this was all over the area, 2,000 acres, including this 160 acre parcel in Rogers Park. We're not sure who actually bought it in that auction or who owned it over the next 50 years. There's kind of lore that says it was owned by a farmer named Henry Newgard, and that's how the street got the name. Honestly, we looked for information on Henry Newgard and we couldn't even find any evidence that he existed. So I don't know about that. There's got to be more research done on that question. But in any case, the land stood empty until, as I said, after 1905. In 1910, a building permit was issued to the property, and it tells us a bunch of stuff. This is how building permits were recorded in those days. When you got a permit, you went down to City Hall and they actually recorded all the information handwritten in a big ledger book. And then at one point, these books were microfilmed, and the microfilm started deteriorating so badly that they were finally digitized. But the result is the quality of this imagery is very bad. We can tell from this, where the building permit is this one that's marked by the line here, a couple of things. One of them is that the expected cost of the property was $5,500. Not the property, the building, the construction of the building, which is pretty typical for buildings in that time period, similar buildings, 2 flats or bungalow houses, that kind of thing. We also know that the owner of the property was listed as a young man named John Ripple, or Rappel, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. His name appears as the owner on 7 properties in the area in this time period, 1910, 1911, 1912. And we're not sure if he was acting as a developer on his own account or if he was actually the agent for a developer or a group of developers, and his name is what got put on the deed. He was an attorney. He originally came from Iowa and went to the University of Michigan for law school, and came to Chicago, started a law practice. He died quite suddenly at the age of 36 in 1916, just as these houses were being built. We don't think he ever lived here, or if he did, it was in a very short period of time. The other thing that we learned from the building permit is the architect was an architect listed as P. Hale. And when we searched this searchable database for P. Hale to see what other buildings he had built, we found 400 entries in 5 years. So Mr. P. Hale was either very busy or there was something else going on. So we did a little more research. He was a man called Pearlie Hale. He was actually a very established architect. He was older than John Ripple and had come to Chicago many years before and had built a lot of houses and other buildings as private commissions as an architect. But he also, by this time period, had entered into a new business, which is selling stock plans. We found this ad. It says, builders, attention, 5 set stock plans, $5 or made to order for $10. Residences, cottages, 2 flats or stores, catalog 25 cents, Pearlie Hale, and then how to reach him. So builders in this era would buy a book of plans, 5 different ones, maybe go buy 5 lots or 10 lots or 50 lots, wherever, and then just build houses using all these different plans, which is a reason that many of the 2 flats in Rogers Park are so similar to each other, and yet each one has kind of a unique character. I lived in a 2 flat very like this house just a few blocks away that was built in exactly the same time period. And I haven't investigated whether it was built from a stock plan, but I'm almost certain that it must have been. So, a little bit more just for your information about Pearlie Hale. I said he came to Chicago much before this. He came around the time of planning for the Chicago World's Fair. And one of the things that he did to kind of make a name for himself in the city was get involved in the fair planning and proposed a bunch of different structures for the fairgrounds. 2 of them made the newspapers, and I thought they were kind of interesting. They were intended as kind of the iconic symbols of the fair, like the Eiffel Tower had been for an earlier World's Fair, a feat of engineering. But these 2, to me, look too much like the Eiffel Tower to really have been seriously considered. They never were built. The fair people eventually chose the Ferris wheel as the icon of the fair. So Pearlie never got these built. This building was built, however. It's in South Shore. It was built for a man named Anton Hansen, who owned a cement manufacturing business, made cement blocks and probably powder cement that you mixed and poured. And he hired Pearlie Hale to construct a home made of cement to show off the materials that he was trying to sell. So if you look at this building, you can see these are cement blocks. This is poured cement. The walls are probably poured cement inside. I don't know. This building is on the National Registry of Historic Places, largely because of its construction. Pearlie Hale also has a number of homes in Chicago that are designated as Chicago landmarks. So if you want to see more of his work, you can Google him and look it up. Shortly after this building was built, Pearlie Hale moved to San Diego and very soon after built this one, which is the Lincoln Hotel. It's in the Gaslight District in downtown San Diego, the historic district. It looks to me like it's also built of cement. I don't know, but it is also on the National Register of Historic Places. So he was a noted architect, but he had this little side business where he probably made a fair amount of money every year selling his stock plans. So by 1913, he was in San Diego John Ripple died in 1916. The house was the only thing left of their work. So what happened to the house? Well, we looked at all the people who subsequently came and lived in the house, and there were a lot of different families and mostly newcomers to Chicago and to the area. I think mostly they were all first-time homeowners when they bought this house. This is just a map that shows the people we're going to talk about. We already talked about the Ripples. The next owners were the Duffys. We'll talk about them in a minute. We had the Mandaba family, the Madden Macaulay family, and Julian de Castofera, who we will meet later. They came from Europe, Northern Ireland, from France, from Wisconsin, from Michigan, from Ohio. Kind of typical of the people who come to Rogers Park even today. Lots of people from the Midwest, lots of people from outside the country. So let's talk about the Duffys. 1916, John Ripple died and the house changed hands, was purchased by a family called the Duffys. They were from, at that point, Wisconsin. They lived in, they were farmers in Springvale, Wisconsin, had a whole lot of children. They had come from Ireland. They had a bunch of children. As the children became adults, many of them moved to Chicago to go to school, to work, to get married. They were all here. That's, again, kind of typical. By 1916, the parents had retired, turned their farm over to another one of their sons, and came to Chicago to live, to be closer to the rest of their family. We first hear about the Duffys in 1919 when we hear reports about Mark Duffy, one of their sons, who was a doctor and who was a World War I war hero. Mark had come, like many of his siblings, to Chicago to come to school. He went to Loyola University and then he attended Northwestern Medical School and became a doctor. He was a doctor already when the US entered World War I, and he was inducted into the military and became a medical officer. He was a lieutenant. In 1919, right at the end of the war, he was awarded a medal, the Distinguished Service Cross, which was one of the highest medals that you could get, for bravery under fire, for having rescued a number of wounded members of his regiment under fire during a very decisive battle that took place in France at the end of the war in 1919. These articles ran in the Tribune after word of this honor got to Chicago in kind of right after the war, December of 1919. And in both of them, the reporter talked to Mark's relatives here, his mother and his sister, who had married by then, but who they found and was identified her. And both of them gave their address as the Newgard address. So the Duffys were living on Newgard, probably in different families in different of the two apartments in 1919, 1920, and for the next several years. We know that because we keep hearing news reports about Mark, who was kind of I think a minor celebrity in Chicago as a result of being a recognized war hero. There was, of course, a lot of recognition and rethinking of the war after that. The Memorial Day became a very big deal. That's when the American Legion started selling poppies in memory of the World War I people who died in World War I. And every Memorial Day, Mark was asked to take part in some Memorial Day celebration where they showed the colors, and it was always with fellow medal winners of the Chicago area. This one happens to be a time when one of the French generals who had fought alongside the American regiment came to Chicago. And this is Mark back here with a shadow on his face. He's not dressed in military uniform because he was already back in civilian life and was a doctor in private practice by then. He was, however, a minor celebrity, and in 1923, he was asked to endorse William Deaver, who was running for mayor at that time. William Deaver was supposedly a reformer. I don't know how much reform actually took place. He was defeated for office the next time, so I guess Chicago wasn't ready for reform. But Mark endorsed him, and probably as a result of being involved in that campaign, he kind of got a political bug. And the next year, he ran himself for office for lieutenant governor of Illinois. He didn't win that election, and after that, he kind of pulled back out of politics and went back to being a doctor. He had a medical office on Broadway, kind of between Lawrence and Montrose, and eventually he got married and went to live in Uptown near his medical office, which remained open until he died in 1947. And he periodically would appear again when there'd be commemorations of the war and stuff like that. So he was kind of known around Chicago for all that time as a Distinguished Service Cross winner. In 1926, however, the Duffys kind of moved on. I'm not sure exactly where they all went or exactly when they sold the house. We know that there was a for sale ad that appeared in 1926. So we know it was somewhere around then. Part of this we don't know stuff is because the Recorder of Deeds of Cook County, which has all these records, has been closed since the shutdown, and we can't get into those property ownership records to verify any of this information. So moving on to the next owners, that was the Mandaba family. Multiple generations of the Mandaba family lived in this house. We think they bought it in 1965. They sold it around the they bought it in 1926. They sold it in the mid 60s, around 1964, 65, something like that. I want to step back a little bit before 1926 to talk about them. The sort of patriarch of the family was someone named Peter Mandaba, who actually died in 1921. He's the one who brought the family here from Columbus, Ohio. And he came to establish and run the National Drug Clerks Association, which was a major trade association headquartered in Chicago for owners of drugstores. It put out all kinds of information about how to market products and set up displays and what the latest trends were in drugstores and how to keep your drugstore clean. All of these kinds of things as ways to service the people who were the members of the organization, which were the individual drugstore owners. He kind of had a tragic death within that organization. He was taking the elevator in the office building where the organization was headquartered, and the doors of the elevator malfunctioned, and he was actually crushed in the elevator shaft in 1961 or in 1921. So kind of a gruesome death, took the organization by shock and threw it into chaos a little bit. His funeral was actually held at the home of his married son, Paul Mandaba, Sr. This was a photo from 1924. In 1921, Paul Mandaba actually lived on Newgard, but not in this house. He lived about 4 houses up the street. We believe he was renting the house at that time. He was married and had 2 small children, one maybe that was not born yet, but eventually had 2 small children. In 1926, the 2 flat down the block went up for sale. And here's the ad, brick 2 flat, 5 and 6 rooms, double garage near Loyola L. So Paul and his wife Irene bought it. They lived there until, as I said, the mid 1960s. Paul died in 1963, but in the meantime, he became head of the Drug Clerks Association after his father died, But then he left the association in 1930s in the middle of the Depression and formed an ad agency called Mandaba and Root, which later became Mandaba and Sims. And during the sort of Mad Men era of the 60s and 70s, and even into the 80s, Mandaba and Sims was one of the top 10 or 15 largest ad agencies in Chicago. And it was run by Paul Seymour, and then after his death in 1963 by Paul Jr. Paul Jr. and Dorothy were Paul Seymour's two children. They grew up in the house on Newgard and both went to Northwestern for college. When they graduated, they each came back and lived on Newgard in various time periods, mostly around the fact that they graduated right before and during World War II, and the whole disruption of the war caused a lot of doubling up at that time. Dorothy graduated in 1940. It's her engagement picture. She was immediately engaged to a man named Thomas Masterson, who also was a Northwestern graduate around the same time. He, in 1940, was almost immediately inducted into the military after the war started in 41. And Dorothy lived with her parents while he was serving overseas for the duration of the war. When he came back in 1945, he came back to this building and they lived there for a little while. Thomas went to graduate school and became a professor of economics at DePaul University, and then later he accepted a professorship in Georgia at Emory University, where Paul and Dorothy lived then for the rest of their life. Paul Jr. was a little bit younger than Dorothy. He graduated Northwestern in 1943. He was in the Naval Reserves even while he was a student at Northwestern, and he went into the Navy right after he graduated, served until after the end of the war, and then he came back to Newgard Street and lived with his parents for a while. He married in 1948, which is about the same time that we found this ad, which we thought was really pretty interesting. It says, veteran with 10 years experience, firing furnace, repairing plumbing, fixing screens, painting interior and exterior, electrical maintenance, financial and material management of building, wants unfurnished apartment, willing to work part-time to take care of the building. It gives his name and his address and 2 phone numbers. One daytime phone number was actually the phone number of Mandaba and Root Advertising. So we know he was working there during the day full time, but there was a housing shortage and he was so kind of wanting to get an apartment for him and his new wife, Claudia, that he was willing to do this part-time work after hours in order to score an apartment. We don't know if he did at that time. We know that eventually Paul and Claudia ended up in Barrington, and he remained with Mandaba and Sims till the end of his life, which was about 1985. So that was the Mandabaks. They had a long history of living in this home. Irene Mandaba lived for a couple of decades after her husband. She remained in Rogers Park, but we think she moved out shortly after his death around 1963, although her obituary describes her as a longtime Rogers Park housewife, recently retired, and that was in 1985. It was kind of sweet. She was also identified as an active member of St. Ignatius Parish, as they all were. So they go back a long time in the history of the neighborhood. In 1965, the home was sold, or at some point in that period, the late 60s, the home was sold to a couple named Joseph and Annette Fontana. Joe Fontana was for a time the executive director of the Rogers Park Community Council, both before and after the time he lived in this house. They only lived here for maybe 2 or 3 years. They lived elsewhere in the neighborhood before they moved into this house. And then when they sold this house, they apparently moved outside the neighborhood. But we don't know very much more about them except that he was clearly pretty active in the community. They sold in 1972 to our next kind of wave of immigrant newcomers, the Maddens, who came from Ulster, Northern Ireland, County Ulster, outside of Belfast, a little town called Hollywood with a 1L. That was really kind of a suburb of Belfast. They came in 1957, so it was before what we think of as the Troubles of Northern Ireland. So I assume they just came seeking a better life. They came separately, but being from the same town, and they came only a couple months apart, I suspect they knew each other at the time when they came from home. They may not have. They may have just coincidentally been from the same town and met each other when they came to Chicago. We do know that they got married in 1960 in Chicago, or actually in Oak Park, and had 2 children almost immediately, because in 1963, when they applied for and became citizens, their citizenship papers say they have 2 native-born children. At the time of 1963, they were living on Catalpa in Edgewater. And then when they bought the house in 1972, they had by then moved to a rental apartment on Albion, just east of Newgard. So they were actually sort of kitty corner from this 2-flat when they bought it, when the house came up for sale in 1972. Here's the ad for that. 2 6-room apartments. Somehow a room got added. Maybe Julian can tell us a little bit about that. 3 bedrooms, brick, 2-flat, beautifully remodeled, 2 apartments, must see, many extras, upper 30s was the price in 1972. So the Maddens bought the house, lived there until 1986, when they sold it to other property owners who apparently at that time operated it as a rental property, because we don't see anybody who stayed there for very long, and we don't find very much information about any of the people who lived there for the next almost 30 years. So it was in and out and was a rental. There may have been an owner that we don't know about, that we just can't find a trace of, but it was not typically owner occupied at that time. It became owner occupied again in 2017 when our current homeowner and the newest newcomer, Julian DaCosta Farrow, came. Julian had immigrated, I'm not exactly sure when, but before this, from Nîmes in France, and was able to purchase this home in 2017 and has lived there ever since, and has done a lovely job of decorating and restoring it. So let's take a tour with Julian.
Welcome. Nice to see you again. My name is Julian DaCosta Farrow. I bought the building June 1st, 2017. It's been 3 years. I'm living here and I love it.
What do you like about the molding? It's very beautiful.
Well, I love the fact it's all original, and it just adds such a very old touch to the place, and it's really nice for me to be able to just put contemporary thing. I just love the molding because it's just almost like the mind of the place, like the history of it, and I just love that. And being French, it kind of reminds me of Paris as well. I just love the heat an old radiator like this produces compared to like forced air. I think it's way better, and those one are hot water, not steam. So it's really like always kind of warm. It doesn't get like crazy hot and then suddenly cold again. The window, all the frame of the window are original. And when I redone the window 3 years ago after buying the building, wood windows are very expensive. So I actually went with vinyl, but it just blends so well that most people think it is wood until they actually put their finger on and realize, oh my God, it's not wood.
Julian, what do you think this nook was used for?
I think it used to be like kind of a built-in library or like a built-in like bar or something. And then from what I heard, the previous owner brother actually kind of tear it down and redone a little bit of the molding. That's why it kind of like look different than this one. But when I actually visited the place, I could see my beautiful like big piece of art just hanging there. That was just like the perfect spot for that. So I love art. I do hair, so it is art. So for me, I have to have like unique pieces.
I know I've seen a lot in your living room. I say we go check it out.
Yes, this piece actually was done by a good friend of mine from Minneapolis, where I used to live. He done that for one of my birthdays, surprised me with, and I just love all the color and the big contrast between the small body and the huge head with one massive eye. I just love the whole like mix of color and shape and everything.
This room is a really long room.
It is, because where I'm standing actually right now, it's the entrance of the building downstairs. So the downstairs unit is very like long and doesn't have this kind of corner here, which I actually love because it's almost like kind of my playroom here with my pinball machine.
Do you actually play your pinball machine?
I do, yeah, I do.
Are
But
you
I
the
do more when I
champion?
have friend over.
Are you the champion?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It was confusing to know which door to use. Do you have any explanation for why there are two front entrances?
Yes, actually. So at one point in Chicago, in I think 1930s or something like that, there were a shortage in room. So people who own a place with a lot of space ended up actually kind of dividing a room to create an extra room to rent. So this was the entrance door for just a room who was just set here. And there is a closet right here. At that time, people were mainly going to public bath, to shower and everything, so they didn't really need like bathroom. So that's the story of that door, which I don't have a key, so I cannot do anything with it.
I think we should visit your sunroom. It looks really bright in there.
So this is my favorite room in the house. I call this my glass box. So when I redone all the window, I really enjoy making this room really like a glass room, because I'm lucky enough to have the two windows giving from the living room into the sunroom. So I didn't have to put any blind or curtain. And I pick casement window because I just love the fact there is not the bar which just blocks the view in a way. And the way you open, I love the cross breeze it creates. And during the winter, I like when it's snowing, for example, I just love to sit in this room because the window have 3 layers of glass, so it cuts the sound. And you just sit here. There is nothing blocking the view because there is no leaf on tree, and it's almost like being outside, but you are protected and warm, but without the feeling of being stuck in a room.
Are you warm in here?
Oh, yes. Yes, very warm. Because of that radiator right here, which is kind of like rare. Normally, sunroom never ever have a radiator, but there is a radiator.
Do you work here?
I actually don't really work here. The only reason I set that up is because I had this old corner I needed to do something with. And then I do cut really few friends at home, which I never actually charged. And it was always hard with the light. So I had to tell them during the winter to come at 1 p.m. to have like a nice light in the sunroom. So I decided to do this because it can like cover some space and it's like just nicer for everybody, me and the friend. So that's why I set that up.
This apartment has more than one type of wood on the floor. Is that correct?
It is correct, yes. And you can really see right here the difference between the front of the house and the back of the house. So I was explained that at the time they were putting oak in the front and maple in the back. Now that's the other way around. And the reason was because the back of the house was more for servant and the front for the owner and their guests. So he has to look more luxurious in the front of the house than the back.
And there's a linen closet in the house?
Correct. So at the time it was making sense because servants were using it to fold and store everything. But I mean, for me, it's just like storage.
I'll get the inside now. Julian, thank you so much for showing us your home.
You're very welcome.
What is it about Rogers Park that you love so much?
I love the diversity in Rogers Park. I love the fact that this neighborhood specifically, it's mainly single family home and 2-flat building. The street I live in is actually the shortest street in Chicago. It's only 4 blocks long. It doesn't start anywhere else or stop anywhere else. It's just 4 blocks. So it's very, very quiet. And when you walk outside, you don't feel you are in a massive city like Chicago. It's more like being in a village in a way.
Why is preserving Chicago's architectural history important to you?
It's important because, first of all, old places are really well built. I mean, this building is over 100 years old and it doesn't look like it. That's why I love. And to me, an old building has a soul on itself. It has history, it has character compared to something brand new. That's what I love. Thank you so much, Rogers Park Historical Society, for coming and featuring my house in your fundraiser. I hope people enjoy.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks to Sarah. Thanks to Patrick Hoda. Very enjoyable tour. Thank you all very much. Okay. Questions, comments?
We'll start with what we have, which is what makes 2-flats attractive properties for newcomers?
Well, there's a reason for that. They're big. The apartments are large. Very often a whole family can take over a building and have a couple of households within the building, which helps when you have a large family or families that immigrate together. And that has been kind of the truth forever in Rogers Park and West Ridge and in lots of places around Chicago. It also is a way to have income coming in as part of the property. So you can get an apartment that's large enough for your own family and then have a rental apartment that brings in some income and helps pay the mortgage. And even 3-flats will do that. They're very usually owner occupied. It's only in more recent years that most of the 2-flats in Chicago were, perhaps not, I won't say most, some of the 2-flats in Chicago were not owner occupied, but mostly they are, and especially in this neighborhood. As I said, I lived in this neighborhood for 35 years, and there were people who had lived there for much longer than me, and rented one apartment and lived in their apartment, raised their kids. It just was a kind of standard thing in the neighborhood.
So you don't think that that's a coincidence or just something unique to Julian's building?
No, not at all. Not at all. It's very typical. We call this a classic Rogers Park two flat because this story is very typical. You could just pick a building and get much the same kind of story.
Do you know if there's a higher density of two flat buildings in Rogers Park than elsewhere in Chicago?
Possibly. I don't know for sure. We've never actually researched that, but I'm sure this is one of the places where there's lots of two flats. There are lots of two flats in parts of West Ridge and Ravenswood and other places on the north side, and also in some places on the south side. But they were all built at about the same time period, that pre-World War I era.
So I have two questions that are similar. Is there still a strong relationship between Loyola University and Rogers Park?
Oh, sure. I mean, strong in the sense of that it's there and they're a very important part of the community. Sometimes it's more friendly than others. So I don't know how to characterize it, but there's a lot of people in the neighborhood who are affiliated in one way or another with Loyola, either as employees, faculty, staff, students, former students, people who come here to go to Loyola and then decide to stay. I mean, it's a very important element of the community for sure. We work a lot with Loyola in the Historical Society. Their students draw on us for help with class projects, and they help us come up with, especially the public history department, come up with ideas for programming and that kind of thing. And some of our very good volunteers over the years have actually started as Loyola students.
Do we know if any of the residents were part of the St. Ignatius Parish since it's so close?
Yes, the Mandabas for sure were very active. I suspect the Macaulay Maddens were as well. I don't know about anybody else, but for sure the Mandabas, they were very definitely part of that parish.
Do you know why the names of Hayes and Southport streets changed?
Southport is a question because it's called Glenwood up here, but there's still a Southport further south, and we don't really know why. Hayes is probably a vestige of the days when, before Rogers Park was part of the city of Chicago, and I suspect there must have been probably another Hayes Street in the city. That's why a lot of the names in the neighborhood changed, but I don't know. The area just north of the Loyola campus has been called Hayes Point, and I don't know enough about the history of that area to know why, but that was just a remnant of things. Streets changed in this neighborhood all the time, and that's one of the challenges of doing research on these properties is you got to know what the name of the street was at the time you're looking for information.
Okay, you had mentioned that there was a housing shortage in Chicago, and Julian mentioned something like that too. Do you know why? What was going on in the city that?
Well, it was going on all over the country. The boys came back from the war and they got married, so they wanted their own household, and they started having kids. This was the start of the baby boom. There had been no construction for 10 years, from 1930 to 15 years, 1930 to 1945. The Depression and the war, nobody was building houses. So there was a housing shortage all over the country, and that's what spurred the growth of the suburbs. that was where the open land was, where people could go put up a lot of buildings all at once, and all the young veterans would come in with their benefits from the GI Bill and go buy their home. It's the American dream. That was the era of the 50s, and that's what happened. And it happened in Rogers Park. There were a lot of buildings in Rogers Park that were subdivided the way Julian showed, where they carve out a room or make 2 apartments out of 1 or that kind of thing. During the Depression, because people had to double up because they had no money. And then after the war also, because housing was so difficult to find. I suspect that little room might have been created for Paul before he got married. I'm not sure, but it seems like it would have been kind of an ideal little bachelor apartment for him, so that he could come and go without going through his parents' house. But I don't know that for sure.
Okay, and this is the final question, unless anybody sends some more my way. Somebody wants to know, is there a record of major work that was done within the 2 flat, or, you know, do we know that?
That's always hard to find out. Technically, any major work that is done in any building in the city of Chicago, you're supposed to get a building permit. Realistically, how many people actually do that is a very, very small proportion of the people who are doing work. Having lived in a building like this, I know there was an awful lot of work done in my building, including making an extra bedroom out of a piece of the living room and a piece of the dining room and all kinds of other things, and there was never a building permit pulled. And even when I owned the building, the only time I ever got a building permit was when we reconstructed the back porch. Had to tear it down and build a new one. And that was a kind of a serious enough project that the contractor did get a building permit. So there's building permits on file. You can ask for them. You can actually file them with a Freedom of Information request. And sometimes you get stuff and sometimes you don't.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. And thank everybody for sticking with us so far. I'll just do another couple of wrap-up things. The first is to tell you about the next stops on the virtual house walk. Next week, October 4th, we're going to Sheridan Road near Rogers, a house that was built in 1922 that has a lovely garden and actually an art gallery on the premises, and it's filled with art. So that will be a very interesting one. The next week, we're going to a home that was built, we think in 1900, around that time anyway, on Greenleaf near Greenview, sort of on the same block as the Rogers Park Presbyterian Church, if people are familiar with that. It's a very beautiful home that it's very large and has a fascinating history. Again, going through a lot of different phases as these booms and busts of the neighborhood occurred. It actually was a boarding house at one point. And then October 18th, we'll be going to the Park Gables apartments. Were built in 1928. It's a co-op apartment complex. For those of you who don't know, it's on Estes, just north of Indian Boundary Park. It's a beautiful location, iconic neighborhood. And we're going to have a very interesting tour of an apartment, the grounds, the common areas. It's going to be really good, as you know, Sarah, because you're working on putting that one together. You have to register individually for each of these tours. Many people have already registered for all of them, and I appreciate that. Please keep it coming. Go to our website and do that. And as I said, we're posting links of the recordings of these sessions on our website. The last one took us almost 2 weeks to figure out the technology, but I think we got it figured out by now. And so later this week, we should have this recording posted to the website. And then lastly, I'll just repeat, we need your support. Please, when you're on our website looking for this recording or to register for the next event, you can join or renew your membership. You can make a donation. You can buy our books. You can get a property history quest report of your own, or at least learn more about what it is that I'm talking about when I say that and what that service entails. Hope you'll do that. Hope you'll join us again next week. And everybody have a great rest of the day. Thank you.